Still, when the cemetery groundskeeper had already grown accustomed to the sight and stopped mentioning it to anyone, an elderly widow visiting her husband's grave for the first time in months noticed a homeless man standing at rigid attention beside an unmarked plot several rows away, offering a slow, precise military salute to a headstone that, as far as she could tell, bore no name at all. She had walked past that same section of the cemetery for years without ever fully registering his presence, but that particular morning, something made her stop and finally ask the groundskeeper who he was and why he came every single day to salute a grave that appeared by every visible indication to be entirely empty. The homeless man's name was Walter Brennigan. He was 67 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had spent the past 6 years living without permanent housing, moving between a modest shelter that offered beds on the coldest nights and various sheltered spots around the city during warmer weather. Every single morning, regardless of season or circumstance, Walter walked the considerable distance to Fairview Memorial Cemetery, arriving precisely at 7 o'clock, to stand at attention before a small, unmarked headstone in a quiet, rarely visited section of the grounds, offering a formal military salute that he held for exactly 30 seconds before turning and walking away. Before we go any further, if you believe that grief and honor sometimes require rituals the rest of the world cannot immediately understand, and that the most meaningful acts of remembrance sometimes look, from the outside, like nothing anyone would think to ask about, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe that loyalty and love can outlast even the most difficult circumstances a person might face. Now, back to the story. The widow's name was Cordelia Ashworth Whitfield, 79 years old, the widow of General Harold Whitfield, a decorated military officer who had passed away 11 years earlier and was buried in a considerably more prominent section of the cemetery, closer to the main entrance, marked by an elaborate headstone befitting his rank and the considerable honors he had received throughout his distinguished military career. Cordelia visited her husband's grave regularly in the years immediately following his death, though her visits had grown less frequent in recent years, as her own health made the journey increasingly difficult to manage without assistance. That particular morning, arriving earlier than her usual visiting hour due to a scheduling change with her caretaker, Cordelia had happened to notice Walter's distant figure through the cemetery's morning mist, his posture unmistakably military despite his clearly difficult circumstances, his salute held with a precision and discipline that immediately caught her attention, given her decades of experience observing military ceremony throughout her husband's long career. She approached the groundskeeper, a patient, long-time cemetery employee named Emmett, who had maintained the grounds for over 15 years, and asked him directly about the man she had observed. Emmett explained, with the particular weary familiarity of someone who had witnessed the same routine for years without ever fully understanding its significance, that the man came every single morning without fail, rain or shine, to salute the same unmarked grave, a plot that Emmett understood, from cemetery records, belonged to an unidentified individual, one of several unmarked plots in that section reserved decades earlier for unclaimed remains that the county had been unable to properly identify or connect with any surviving family. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what Cordelia decided to do next required a specific kind of courage that many people, observing a homeless stranger's unusual daily ritual, might have simply continued to overlook rather than genuinely investigate. She approached Walter directly the following morning, waiting patiently near the unmarked grave until he completed his customary 30-second salute, and then, gently and without any presumption of entitlement to his private grief, asked him whose grave he came to honor every single day. What followed was a conversation that unfolded slowly over the following several weeks, Walter, initially hesitant and guarded, unaccustomed to anyone taking genuine interest in a ritual he had maintained largely in solitude for years, gradually opening up as Cordelia's patient, respectful curiosity convinced him that her interest came from genuine care rather than simple idle nosiness. Walter explained that the unmarked grave belonged to his closest friend and fellow soldier, a man named Marcus Delgado, who had served alongside him during their deployment in Vietnam decades earlier. Marcus had saved Walter's life during a particularly harrowing combat engagement, pulling him to safety under heavy fire despite his own significant injuries. Injuries that Marcus himself did not survive, passing away from his wounds during the difficult evacuation that followed. Marcus's remains, due to a combination of wartime record-keeping complications and the chaos of that particular period in the conflict, had eventually been misidentified, and through a series of bureaucratic errors that Walter had spent decades trying unsuccessfully to correct, had ultimately been buried in this unmarked plot at Fairview Memorial, rather than properly identified and returned to his own family, who Walter believed had never learned what had truly happened to their son. Walter had discovered the location of Marcus's actual burial site only several years earlier, after decades of persistent inquiry through various Veterans Affairs channels, finally piecing together enough fragmented documentation to confirm with reasonable certainty that the unmarked grave at Fairview Memorial contained his friend's remains, misidentified and improperly processed during the considerable administrative chaos of that particular era. By the time Walter made this discovery, its own life had already been derailed by decades of struggle with what would later be recognized as untreated post-traumatic stress from his own combat experience. Struggles that had eventually cost him his housing, his marriage, and much of the stable life he had once built in the years immediately following his return from service. Despite his own considerable hardship, Walter had committed himself to the daily ritual of visiting and saluting his friend's grave, understanding that he could not, given his own limited resources and the complex bureaucratic barriers involved, properly correct the historical error that had left Marcus buried without identification or honor, but determined nonetheless that his friend would not go entirely unremembered, that someone would show up every single day to acknowledge the sacrifice Marcus had made, even if the official record failed to reflect it properly. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the specific history and sacrifice that had shaped Walter's decades-long commitment to this daily ritual, a commitment that persisted through considerable personal hardship, precisely because Walter believed, with an unwavering conviction that had outlasted every other stability in his life, that honoring his friend's sacrifice mattered more than any of his own considerable struggles. Cordelia, moved profoundly by Walter's story, found herself drawing on her own extensive connections within military and Veterans Affairs circles. Connections built over decades as a general's wife, deeply involved in supporting military families and honoring service members throughout her husband's long career. She began, with Walter's careful guidance and the fragmented documentation he had spent years compiling, a formal effort to properly investigate and correct Marcus Delgado's burial identification, working with Veterans Affairs officials and military records specialists to finally resolve a decades-old bureaucratic error that had left a genuine war hero buried without proper honor or identification. The process proved considerably more complex than either of them initially anticipated, requiring extensive documentation review, DNA verification procedures that had not been available during the original burial decades earlier, and careful coordination between multiple government agencies whose fragmented wartime records had contributed to the original error in the first place. Cordelia, drawing on both her considerable patience and her extensive network of contacts, persisted through this lengthy process with a determination that mirrored Walter's own decades-long commitment to his friend's memory. Nearly a year after that first conversation, the investigation finally confirmed, through DNA analysis and cross-referenced military records, that the unmarked grave did indeed contain Marcus Delgado's remains, finally resolving a bureaucratic error that had persisted for decades. Marcus's surviving family, a younger sister named Dolores, who had spent her entire adult life believing her brother's remains had never been recovered at all, was located and formally notified. An emotional reunion of sorts between a family and the brother they had long believed permanently lost to the chaos of war. What followed was a formal military reburial ceremony, held with full honors befitting Marcus's genuine heroism. His family finally able to properly grieve and honor a brother whose sacrifice had gone unrecognized for decades due to circumstances entirely outside anyone's individual control. Walter, invited to attend as the guest of honor given his central role in finally uncovering the truth, stood once more at attention, offering his familiar salute, though this time surrounded by full military ceremony rather than the solitary daily ritual he had maintained for years in relative obscurity. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge that Cordelia's involvement in resolving Marcus's case led her to a broader recognition of Walter's own considerable unaddressed needs, a recognition she could not simply set aside once the formal military matter had been resolved. She learned, through their growing friendship over the many months of the investigation, the full scope of Walter's own struggles with homelessness and untreated combat-related mental health challenges, struggles that had persisted for decades, without the kind of dedicated support that might have addressed them considerably earlier. Cordelia, drawing again on her extensive Veterans Affairs connections, helped Walter access a specialized housing and mental health support program specifically designed for veterans navigating the kind of complex, long-term trauma that had shaped so much of his difficult post-service life. The transition was neither quick nor simple, requiring Walter to navigate considerable personal difficulty in finally addressing decades of untreated psychological wounds. But with consistent support from both the specialized program and Cordelia's continued personal involvement, he gradually began building a stability that had eluded him for the better part of 2 decades. 2 years passed. Walter, now 69, had settled into stable, supported housing, continuing his daily visits to Fairview Memorial, though now to Marcus's properly identified and honored grave, rather than the anonymous plot he had maintained his solitary vigil beside for so many years. His relationship with Cordelia had grown into a genuine, cherished friendship, the two of them meeting regularly, Cordelia often accompanying him on his morning visits to Marcus's grave. The elderly general's widow and the homeless veteran having formed a bond neither of them could have anticipated. On that first misty morning, she finally decided to ask why he saluted an empty grave. Dolores, Marcus's sister, remained close with both Walter and Cordelia in the years following the reburial ceremony. Grateful beyond words for the decades of loyal remembrance Walter had maintained on her brother's behalf, even during his own most difficult years of struggle, understanding fully that without his persistent, patient commitment, her brother's true resting place might never have been properly identified and honored at all. On the anniversary of that pivotal first conversation, Cordelia and Walter visited Marcus's grave together, as had become their regular practice. And Cordelia, reflecting on the entire journey that had unfolded since that misty morning, she finally decided to ask a question she had overlooked for years. Told Walter that she considered their unlikely friendship one of the most meaningful developments of her own long life. A reminder that genuine honor and loyalty could persist through even the most difficult circumstances a person might face, waiting patiently, sometimes for decades, until someone finally took the time to notice and ask why. In the weeks following that first conversation, Cordelia found herself reflecting deeply on the sheer scope of Walter's decades-long commitment, understanding that his daily ritual had persisted through every conceivable hardship, homelessness, untreated trauma, and the profound isolation that so often accompanies both, without ever once wavering from the specific promise he had made himself years earlier to ensure his friend's sacrifice would not go entirely unremembered. She began researching the specific bureaucratic processes involved in correcting historical burial misidentifications, quickly discovering that the process required considerably more documentation and institutional patience than either of them had initially anticipated. Emmett, the cemetery groundskeeper who had observed Walter's daily ritual for years without ever fully understanding its significance, found himself deeply moved once Cordelia shared the full story with him, admitting that he had long assumed Walter's routine represented some form of unresolved grief, without ever considering that an actual historical error might lie beneath it. He became, in the months that followed, an unexpected but genuinely helpful ally in the investigation, providing detailed cemetery records and historical documentation about the specific unmarked plot that proved instrumental in eventually confirming Marcus's true identity. The Veterans Affairs officials Cordelia eventually connected with, initially skeptical given the considerable age of the case and the fragmented nature of the available wartime documentation, gradually became genuinely invested in the investigation once they reviewed the specific details Walter had spent years compiling through his own persistent, if largely unsuccessful, inquiries. One official in particular, a record specialist named Antonio, who had spent much of his career working on similar historical identification cases, later described Walter's case as one of the most thoroughly documented instances of civilian-driven historical correction he had encountered in his considerable career, a testament to the sheer persistence Walter had maintained, despite lacking any of the institutional resources that typically supported such investigations. Dolores, once located and formally notified of the investigation's progress, initially struggled to fully process the possibility that her brother's remains might finally be properly identified after decades of believing he had been permanently lost to the chaos of war. She had spent much of her adult life carrying a specific unresolved grief, understanding that her brother had died in service, but never having the closure of a proper burial site to visit or honor. A grief that Cordelia and Walter's investigation ultimately promised to finally resolve after so many years of painful uncertainty. Walter's own journey through the specialized veterans housing and mental health program Cordelia helped connect him with proved considerably more difficult than the relatively straightforward bureaucratic resolution of Marcus's identification case, requiring him to confront decades of untreated combat trauma that had shaped nearly every aspect of his difficult post-service life. His therapist within the program, a counselor named Rosalind, who specialized specifically in combat-related post-traumatic stress among older veterans, noted that Walter's decades-long ritual of visiting Marcus's grave had likely served, in its own unconscious way, as a form of self-directed therapy, long before he had any access to formal treatment, a consistent structure and purpose that had perhaps prevented his overall deterioration from becoming even more severe than it ultimately became. Cordelia's own late husband, General Whitfield, had known Marcus Delgado only peripherally through broader military circles decades earlier, a connection Cordelia discovered only after beginning her investigation into the burial identification, adding an unexpected layer of personal significance to her involvement in the case. She found herself, in the months of research and advocacy that followed, drawing directly on the decades of military community knowledge and protocol she had absorbed throughout her husband's long career, applying that considerable expertise toward finally resolving an injustice that had persisted for far too long. Never underestimate the depth of loyalty and honor a person can maintain even through their own considerable personal struggles. Never assume that an unusual daily ritual, however unexplained, lacks profound meaning behind it. Never overlook someone simply because their circumstances make them easy to walk past without question. And never forget that sometimes the most important act of remembrance is not the grand formal ceremony, but the quiet, persistent commitment of someone who refuses to let a sacrifice go unhonored, regardless of how difficult their own circumstances have become. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that loyalty and honor can persist through even the hardest circumstances a person might face. Subscribe for more stories about sacrifice, remembrance, and the unexpected friendships that reveal the depth of devotion so many people quietly carry. Because sometimes the most profound act of honor happens not in a formal ceremony, but in the quiet, unwavering commitment of someone who shows up every single morning, rain or shine, simply because a promise to remember still matters.